Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddits. Let's get right into it. So first we have, taxes go to genocides, wars, and surveillance. The higher the taxes, the more are murdered and spied. Posted by Hot Organization 157, and that's a cross post from the Ideology of Justice subreddit, and it says, tax-funded programs. It's the crying Wojak, and he says, if you're going to take my money, could you at least spend it on a social safety net or something? And the other two, there's the grinning Wojak and the evil smile Wojak, and the evil smile Wojak is IPAC, the logo above his head, and then they say, well, I guess we could use some of it for that, but the rest goes to Israel. They need it more than you do. Then it says charity, and it's the Chad Wojak. He says, here's a check. I expect this money to be used to help sick kids and their families. That's fair. And then the other guy says, Overwatch says, of course, so we may need to use some of the money to run our charity. And they have mutually decided, and that's two Chad Wojaks talking, bro, what if we all pulled our money together into a big fund that we could each draw from if we fall in all our times? And the other Wojak says, dope, let's also make it like a club where we can all hang out and build a sense of community over our families. And I'd agree with all that, a lot of people might say, oh, taxes taxes go to bad things. We'll agree that taxes go to bad things. We'll say, well, what if my side takes over and taxes will only go to what I label as good things? And, ultimately, I think that might be well intentioned, but, what people consider good things might differ from person to person. Some people consider abortion a good thing. Some people consider abortion a bad thing. And still other people consider abortion like a morally neutral thing. And, that's why, some people might consider taxpayer-funded abortions to be a good thing. And some people might consider it to be a bad thing. And some people might be, kind of in the middle between those. Ultimately, that's why I think we need to get rid of forced taxation and rather have, like, a mutual aid society like this meme suggests. I think if people want to spend... want to give people money just so they can get abortions if they want to, that's fine. But, you shouldn't be forced to do that if you don't want to. It's the same with pretty much everything else. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, Steve Miller states that Trump has plenary authority, then immediately stops talking as if he's realized what he just said, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Facepalm subreddit. And, yeah, personally, I think that, Trump shouldn't have absolute authority, which I think that's what he means by plenary authority. But, ultimately, if government officials like Stephen Miller want to give Trump as much authority as possible, they should be able to. But, ultimately, just because someone has authority doesn't make all that authority justified, and that's very much the case when it comes to government. Just because the government has the authority to do something doesn't make it right, and that's very much why it needs to be resisted as much as possible, I would say. Because, the only reason that the government has any authority in the first place is that they have a monopoly on the use of force, and that's very much... if they didn't have the monopoly use of force, then they wouldn't have any authority at all, pretty much. And that's very much why, you gotta resist the government, because just because they have the authority to do something because they have the legal monopoly use of force, that doesn't make it right. Then we have, when Trump finally gets his way and topples the U.S. government and becomes our new fearless leader, will the Republicans and MAGA cheer this, or will they wonder what they've done? Posted by Plasman30, and they said, politics has always been an us versus them game, and many people fever party want their chance to be at the top of the food chain and become POTUS, and they use the other side wing to give them money and convince you to vote. Well, when there's no them anymore to convince you to hand over your money to them, and you can't hope to ascend to the top anymore politically, will that finally make these idiots realize that they've done, or will they cheer the fall of our country until the secret police come take them away in the middle of the night? And, yeah, personally, I think, I would agree with that, personally, but that's why I don't think it's going to happen, but they need the us versus them game forever, and Trump's just the latest part of that. I've been told Trump's going to become literally worse than Hitler every day now, for the past 10 years, pretty much, and that still hasn't come to pass. Eventually Trump's going to go and replaced by someone else who's going to take over, who's going to become the next boogeyman, and that's very much the pattern I see, Could Trump become a Hitler-like dictator? Possibly, but I personally don't think the American people would allow him to do that. And Trump very much does what he knows what he can and can't get away with, and that's how he's managed to stay politically relevant for a decade plus at this point. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have Trump's Gestapo assaulting innocents without any accountability as usual, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Trump virus subreddit. And it looks like a tweet from MC Squared 34 who tweeted, Gestapo assaulting unarmed clergymen in Chicago, October 2025. And that looks like a quote to a tweet. They quote a quote post from Comrade Dale Earnhardt tweet: "Ice sprays directly in the face of the lead pastor for First Presbyterian in Chicago. The photo I believe will go down in history." And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting. Trump very much says, "Oh, there's an anti-Christian bias in this country," but it looks like he said his federal agents are assaulting a clergyman right here. So it just goes to show you, it's very Christianity, like much other things. It comes down to who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. Reddit usually despises Christianity, but they love this photo because it shows that it's a guy standing up against ICE. Who happens to be a Christian. It's kind of like how they love that the bishop who woke scolded Trump during his inauguration. But even though they despise Christianity. Jimmy Carr is another example. He's a 100-year-old evangelical Christian from the South. A group that Reddit usually despises, but they liked him because he had the magical D next to his name. So that's very much Reddit. They usually despise Christianity unless they can find a way to include it in the in-group category instead of the out-group category, and this is very much an example of that. Then we have Vices versus Crimes. Why victimless crimes aren't criminals, posted by Hot Organization 157, and that's a cross-post from the Ideology of Justice subreddit, and that looks like a meme from Lysander Spooner, a quote, I guess I should say. Vices are simply the errors which a man makes in his search after his own happiness. Unlike crimes, they imply no malice toward others and no interference with their persons or property. And then they have a wall of text about that. Vices are those acts which a man harms himself or his property. Crimes are those acts by which one man harms person or property of another. Vices are simply the errors which a man makes in his search after his own happiness. Unlike crimes, they imply no malice toward others and no interference with their persons or property. And vices, the very essence of crime, that is, designed to injure the person or property of another is wanting. It is a maxim of the law that there can be no crime without criminal intent. That is, without the intent to invade the person or property of another. But no one ever practices a vice without any such criminal intent. He practices his vice for his own happiness solely and not for malice toward others. And they have a few more paragraphs, but I'll go over those. And I'd agree with that. Personally, I don't think you should be out in the street tripping out on drugs all day, or cutting yourself, or jerking off to bluey porn. But, ultimately, if you're not hurting anyone else, you can keep them to yourself. I think that's fine, Personally, from a libertarian perspective, I think those acts are all kind of, if I saw someone jerking off to like snuff films or child porn on the street, I personally think that's wrong, and I think it should definitely be stigmatized. But from a purely libertarian perspective, the NAP isn't being violated. If no one else is forced to interact with you, then you should be able to do whatever you want, and that's very much libertarian ethos, even if it's something completely undefensible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Pam Bondi. Just like we did with cartels, we're going to take the same approach for Antifa. We're going to destroy the organization from top to bottom, posted by Paton13, and that's cross-post from the Boomers Being Fools subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Antifa. I think they're just a bunch of leftist LARPers, just like their right-wing equivalents, like the Proud Boys, the Free Percenters, the Oath Keepers, etc., etc. But, if the government wants to label anyone they don't like, wants to go after Antifa, personally, I don't really think they should be going after people if they're not being violent. But, ultimately, Antifa's not in the right here either, I would say, because Antifa, sometimes they do use force to get what they want, just like the government does, and if you're using force to get what you want, that's not very libertarian. And yeah, personally, I think Antifa, they'll always say, oh, if you don't like Trump, you're Antifa. Well, in reality, I would say, it's very much like Antifa's just the label they have. It's like, you'll say to them, oh, is the North Korea the Democratic People's Republic of Korea actually Democratic People's Republic, or were the Nazis actually socialists? They say it's in the name. Oh, we're the anti-bad guy squad. Anyone we don't like is a bad guy, and that's very much what Antifa is. It's very much a leftist circle jerk that I personally don't care for. But I think the libertarian position is, rather than go after them with the four yugas of the state, is just let them to burn themselves out and become irrelevant. And I think that's gradually what's been happening to Antifa over the past decade. In 2020 they were pretty much everywhere with the George Floyd riots. But now, you barely hear about them anymore, because I think most of them have pretty much burned themselves out by this point. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Why Trump and Exif Shouldn't Have the Military Blowing Up Boats in the Caribbean by Patom 14, and that's crosspost from the Narco-Capitalism subreddit. And that looks like, I guess they're asking Rand Paul, looks like a clip of Rand Paul saying that. And yeah, personally, I would agree with Rand Paul there, just because, the boats might be bringing drugs and crime to the U.S. doesn't mean that the U.S. has the right to just attack them without any checks and balances, I mean, technically, I guess they do, since they have the legal monopoly to force justify pretty much whatever they want to. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, you shouldn't be attacking people if they're not hurting anyone else, and they're just in a boat floating along. Maybe when they dock and start selling drugs, and dock with selling drugs to everyone, and bringing gang members as well on the shores, maybe then they'd be more justified going after them, I would say. But just because they're not committing they might commit crimes doesn't mean you can just kill them for pre-crime. It's very much like I think Minority Report, where people get killed because they might commit crime. Just because you might commit a crime doesn't mean you should be killed. And even if I personally don't really care for the boats and a lot of people on them, that doesn't give the U.S. government a blank check to just destroy them without any accountability. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Christina Holmes says Antifa is just as dangerous as MS-13, as ISIS, as Hezbollah, as Hamas, as all of them. Christy said this with a completely straight face, posted by Ragnarok XG, and that's crosspost from the cringe TikTok subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think Antifa, as I said earlier, they're pretty much a bunch of LARPers. I wouldn't put them in the same category as MS-13, ISIS, Hezbollah, or Hamas. But ultimately, if the government wants to label them as in that category, ultimately they have the justification of they pretty much doing whatever they want to, since they have legal monopolies of force, and there's nothing you can really do about it. But yeah, personally, I would say, as I said earlier, Antifa really is just they're the same people who say, oh, the Nazis weren't socialists just because they had socialists in their name. Just because they call themselves anti-fascists doesn't mean they're automatically anti-fascists. I would say, they're really anti-anything, anti any dissent at all from the official leftist narrative, and that's not something I personally care for. With that being said, as I they're pretty much just a bunch of LARPers rather than an actual threat like ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, or MS-13. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.